Hello, everybody. Rhett here. The gang has had a scheduling mishap on the road, and their wagons were accosted by bandits. But while we send out some help to parley with the bandits' leader, I am going to cover our bases and read you my story that was first published in Savage Realms Monthly, issue number 40, I think, from December 2025. It's called Black Fruit. And normally I'd give you the full audiobook treatment, like I did last time when I read to you The Seven Sealed Flask. But in the interest of your time and mine, we're going to do this like an old campfire read. So here we are, tuckered away in the corner of the inn at the end, where normally you'd be sitting, listening to Alex whisk you into the fever dream of High Rock, and we'd be cracking a can. But today, I've got a cup of coffee and a water bottle. And I'm just going to read you this. We're going to do our best. Minimal editing today. The story's called Black Fruit. I wrote it. It starts like this. Old grudges bear black fruit. A single taste can turn a soul sour. For those whom one bite is never enough, a grudge deals death. It's an old Ascalontian proverb. 3 days south of the Staghorn strode Strummer by moonlit path, named thus either for the sweet sing-song of his mandolin or his knack with the bow, depending on whom you ask. Carried on the chill of an east wind, the first of many that marked the end of autumn, his feet moved over the forest floor like a priest's in his sanctuary. An old moon rose slow and limp over the ink-black canopy above, casting the wilderness in a pale, ghostly light and lending the Staghorn itself the air of a titanic tombstone. His destination was the lonely, withered mountain peak jutting out of the lowly crescent hills like a broken tooth, the Staghorn. It was a beautiful place, and remote, too. He could see it now, glaring down over the forest like a stoic parent. With any luck, he'd reach the eastern face by the time the old moon retired, giving up the ghost to rest for a spell before rising anew, and he could lay Pike to rest in time for sunrise. Patting the oiled sack tied to his hip, Strummer said, "We'll be there soon, old friend." Pike once told Strummer he dreamed of taking his final rest on the Staghorn, far away from the ridiculous customs of civilized folk, with one last sunrise blazing over the horizon to carry him across the vale. Strummer couldn't shed the thought that he owed Pike as much. Without knowing, Pike helped Strummer close a blood debt. Just by virtue of their acquaintance, Strummer was able to hunt down an elusive wind soul, sealed now in an arcane flask on his hip. Following a winding deer trail, Strummer found where it bisected a babbling meadow brook. The old moon climbed high until it was carried across chill blue skies, and the sun poked through the autumn foliage. He refilled his empty water skins and followed the water upstream until midday, when he took a rest and allowed the scanning wildcats to finish their patrol. Except, come midday, he got little rest. As Strummer fussed over his mandolin, ensuring it was kept dry, he heard the ruckus stirring in the glade to the east, but his primal brain dismissed it until the howls of mortal struggle snapped him from his idling. Trading his mandolin for his bow, Strummer bounded through the wooded way, careful to keep low, stepping around dry branches that would surely give him away. Men shouted in the distance, barking, snarling at one another. They sounded little more than animals, but one voice corralled the chaos. It brimmed with authority. Ahead, men closed rank, shoulder to shoulder, 5 spears leveled at them. 5 spears leveled at the beast Strummer had been so keen to elude. She was a mighty large specimen, all fangs and claws, with a coat like striped sunset. From its throat loosed a roar that rattled Strummer's teeth and would have shattered the spear wall if not for their commander pealing in their ears and burgeoning their resolve. "Hold fast, men," their commander barked. He was clad head to toe in a tarnished metal shell that was blasted and battered, telling of many battles. As Strummer drew closer, he saw the beast had felled one fighter already. She stood fierce and greedy over the corpse, one giant paw pressed to his breast, lips curled, fangs bared. She slashed at the air with a mighty paw, daring the men to test her, waiting for an opening to take another soul. From beyond the glade whizzed an arrow, thumping into the rear of the cat, striking its haunched leg. She loosed another roar, and this time the spear wall broke. But the men didn't flee. They stabbed frantically, maiming the beast but failing to end it. In the last throes of life, the cat surged like a coiled spring, knocking back a spear and lashing at a man with such intense violence that the remaining 4 scattered back several paces. Now the beast had 2 bodies to covet, though the fighter may yet live. The beast was done. There was no recovery from wounds so severe. "Easy," one shouted. "Damn thing won't die," howled another. "What are we waiting for?" Such careless men, Strummer thought. Such ruinous fools. That tiger was the closest thing he had to a neighbor these past few weeks. He knocked an arrow and loosed in one motion, striking true, clean through the lungs and heart, slicing right between the ribs. She died painlessly and suffered no more. "Who goes there?" they called in a panic. "Stop lurking in the woods and face us!" Better to evaporate into the wilderness than risk judgment at the hands of civilized folk. This far from the wind-baked walls of Balhiric, men were capricious at best. But the sight of the staghorn, looming above them, changed his mind, and he stepped into the clearing, careful to hold his bow away from his body, keeping his free hand in plain view. Blast! There were more men than Strummer thought, a full party of fighters. There was at least half a dozen he didn't see from the trees. As he approached, a few fighters laid down their spears and tended to the wounded. Of the 2 on the ground, one was still alive and lucky to be so by the looks of the bright red gash across his neck and chest. A dozen men wouldn't normally worry Strummer. He just fought his way out of worse odds back in Balhiric, but 3 men, ironclad, stalked the clearing. And ironclad men were exceptionally hard to kill when there was a need. "That's far enough," one fighter stopped him. He was a powerful man with a stout metal cudgel on his hip. His boiled leather armor creaked as he leaned in, eyeing the leather mandolin case, and asked with a thick southern accent, "Why strays a bard so far from an alehouse?" From one predator to the next, Strummer would rather juggle the dangers of a wild mountain cat than deal with the threats posed by a dozen armed men so far from the rules and laws that governed their behavior. To the staghorn over north, he jutted his chin at the impending peak. "I carry a dear friend to rest." A degree of honesty, he elected, would sate these men's fears. Many eyes were on him now. The commander of the shield wall trained his gaze on Strummer, while 3 spearmen began circling around him. And beyond the glade, the archer who first tagged the tiger still hid. No doubt Strummer was now fixed in his sight. The man rested his hand on the pommel of his club and cast a frantic glance back at his ironclad commander, whose icy blue eyes betrayed nothing. "We see no friend," he said, turning back to Strummer. No, these men were not mere predators. They were hornets. Strummer had just kicked their nest, and now he could almost hear their buzzing. There was no reasoning with a swarm. Slowly, presenting an empty palm, Strummer undid the oiled sack that carried Pike from his belt, then hoisted it before him, offering it in place of an elaboration. The swarm wasted no time conferring. First, the commander joined the speaker's side. Then another ironclad fighter stormed forward and seized Strummer's sack, checking its contents before handing it back to the leader. "We cannot be sure you are what you say you are. Spies abound, and our master bids that not a word of our whereabouts reach the ears of our enemies," the commander said. "There's no enemies this far from Balhyric save those you bring with you," Strummer asserted. The commander shot forward and nearly threw the speaker out of the way. "Our enemies have eyes where we least expect. As far as I'm concerned, you are aiming for my men when your arrow mistakenly killed that beast. Davin, if you please." He nodded toward his speaker, Davin, who moved his hand away from his cudgel and produced a pair of slim iron shackles. "If I refuse?" asked Strummer. How he'd crack those iron shells he'd have to figure out on the go. Perhaps he could outrun them. "Your friend," he lifted Pike's head, "will have to be content to rest in the first pish-filled bog we pass, and you'll be just another dead outlander." Strummer caught the faintest discord in his voice. Whether tone or timbre betrayed him, only Strummer's trained ears detected it. The man was at odds with his own threats, but the overtones of authority obfuscated any doubt. Strummer stepped back as Davin approached him. The start caused several others to level Steela's way or grip their swords at their belts, but it was the sharp prick of a broadhead in the small of his back that drew from him a wince and told him he was done, that he was surrounded. "With promises like that, how can I be sure I'll ever be let free?" Strummer asked, and offered his bow in surrender, holding his hands up. As Davin stepped forth, a flurry of men did too, seizing his bow, his keen short sword, the knife on his hip, the knife on his chest, plucking every arrow and blade they could before dumping the contents of his bag and seizing even the 7-sealed flask. It occurred to him that he should warn them not to open it, but they seemed to handle it like any other ordinary item, and he bit his tongue. The less they knew of it and its contents, the better. It was the mandolin, though, that drew protest from Strummer. But the broadhead on his back bought his compliance. The commander took heed of his protestations and called out, "Matt, bring it here." It was housed in a simple case, oiled leather over hard wood, clasped closed with leather thongs and brass buckles. It did a trick keeping the moisture out this far from a roof. The commander plopped it on the grass and undid the buckles, glaring at Strummer all the while. Inside was a rustic mandolin. It didn't look like much, but it was handmade, with a bowl of poplar and a sounding board of maple. The real treat, though, was copper-wound strings, common enough in the small kingdoms south of Balhyric, but virtually unheard of this far from its borders. To Strummer's relief, the commander handled it with the delicate care a craftsman gives all of his tools. But when he held it up by the neck, he growled, "Obey my commands, and I'll see this back to you safely." and he tossed it into the case unceremoniously and buckled it closed, slinging it over his back, trudging to the far end of the clearing. "I'm no threat without my steel," Strummer called. But the man didn't bother to respond. Strummer felt no better than a dog being muzzled. "A captain can be a tough sod," Davin told him as he clasped irons around Strummer's wrists. "But if you'd seen the things we've seen, just be thankful we can't afford to carry you." Across the verdant expanse, we're kind of in a new chapter here. Across the verdant expanse rushed an east wind, and the green boughs of even the mightiest trees bowed at its passing before it broke against the black stone walls of what was once the Lord of Ascalant's seat of power, but was now the wild refuge of Shigerak, seer to the house Siminius, and concubine to Lord Edgar himself. Against the stones and through the gaps in its masonry, the wind carried a message, marking the passage of autumn, the coming of winter to those without ears to listen, and a master's bidding to those who did. At her desk, Shigerak consulted a luminous tome, hand-printed on vellum and bound in supple sheepskin. A black candle billowed in the draught, and the pages fluttered. Her master beckoned. "My lord, your servant is here. What do you bid?" Shigerak said. "How grows the princeling?" The call was cosmic, eminent. It burned as the candle burned before her and shivered like the rattling windows behind her. "Your vessel burgeons, lord. It is strong." "The way calls." She'd been counting the hours diligently. Of course she knew the path was opening, but she bit her tongue. It had been 7 years. What were a few more days? "Your passage will be clear. There's not a pact I've failed to keep." "It is not your heart I doubt." What then? Her will? Strength? Should she recount their bargain? She bit her tongue before she spit something she'd regret. "I strive for your excellence." But no response came. Her master called through the cosmic gulf, only to nag. Something inside Shigerak seethed. She had sacrificed so much to see the Red One borne safely to the earth. Even her body was no longer her own. The festering seed of Lord Edgar now ripened full in her belly and even kicked her while she slept. Now he doubted what? Not her heart, no. A woman's heart could never be doubted. But her resolve? Her ability? Her strength? It was just like a man to doubt what he hadn't the capacity to perceive. Though the Red One was no mere mortal. It was a misconception she struggled to contain, likely because men so often thought themselves godly. It was said the elders, masters of the primordial universe, precursors to man and beast alike, were born free of desire. But all she knew of the Red One was desire, or something worse, something deeper. A hunger? More like starvation. Shigerak had whittled that absolute yearning into a tool of her own devise. The Red One thought himself so high, he spared little thought for those he believed to be his servants, his thralls. When the way was clear and the Red One joined his mind, body, and soul into her womb, into the flesh that grew there, he would be bound to his oaths as powerfully and absolutely as she. If his designs were so important, he'd have to end the line of Siminius to pursue them. It was time to make preparations. She had collected the things she'd need for the invocation, but the circle work would be exacting, and her condition made nothing easier. In the dim corners of her chamber, a skittering drew her attention back to the present circumstance. An 8-legged shadow unfurled, careful to keep from the light, and whispered. "The boy draws near," it said. "You've performed well," she said. "But his time is up. Bring him. Kill the rest." "As you wish." And the shadow dissolved into the night. Lighting the room with nothing but blood-red spectral lamps, she set to her grim works. Chapter 3. You guys bearing with me so far? We're doing good. Yeah, let's go. Don't know why I said that. Chapter 3. They traveled for 3 days and 3 nights, moving deeper into the wilderness, but further away from the Staghorn. Their purpose in these lands eluded him, but Strummer never wasted an opportunity to study a threat. He took careful stock of their numbers, their supplies, their heading, anything that might help secure his freedom. Rarely was such a regiment of fighters seen so deep in the wilds. Strummer pegged them as sellswords, but their commander's stern hand molded them into something more. Strummer gleaned that the commander's name was Argent, and that he served a yet unseen nobleman traveling in their midst. 13 had set out from Balheric. Now there were 11. 4 of them, Strummer presumed, were sworn men, perhaps even knights. Dabin was his jailer, tending to Strummer's needs. He was funny and kind, ensuring Strummer had plenty of food and water, even offering to dry his boots at the end of a long, wet day. Strummer had come to like him, despite the present circumstance, and he relished every chance to learn as much as he could about the party. Though Dabin was disciplined, he spoke freely and easily, casually dropping names as though Strummer knew them all. Of all the crew, there was only a single outsider among them, a hired guide to take them from the walls of Bal through the wilderness and back without stepping in a viper's nest. He didn't fit in, though to his credit, he didn't try. They called him Sniffer to agitate him, presumably because of his unusual hawk-like nose. But he was a competent guide. On more than one occasion, he deftly maneuvered the party away from danger without raising a fuss. One time, scavenging bear cubs preparing for cold winter. Another time, a circling manticore. Strummer had picked up on those threats long before Sniffer did, even while chained. His senses were different from most people's, but even so, Sniffer's command of the party's movement was inspired. And on a good day, he even brought a stag back to camp, shot clean through the heart. It was Argent who concerned Strummer the most, however. Wherever he stood proud and tall like a flagpole or a loyal hound, as though the dirt beneath his boots was his alone. His strength was evident, even beneath his iron shell. He commanded through conviction and unshakable resolve, and understood his men as well as he understood the broad-headed axe living on his hip. But the worst of all, he was alert, the most dangerous of all virtues, and not one possessed by most civilized men. It took all 3 days before any of them other than Dabin worked up the courage to speak to Strummer. The first was a young man, a squire, Strummer guessed. His name was Ewan. He offered brief pleasantries, as pleasant as they could be while Strummer was chained. From him, it didn't take long for the rest of the camp to learn Strummer could entertain as well as he could aim a bow, a calculated truth he peppered into conversations with Ewan. Talk of songs took the camp like a fever. Rain had dampened their spirits, slowing their progress and drawing muddled curses from pursed lips. But when it dried out, the men perked up. It was late, deep into the night. The goose road twinkled, but the old moon, nearly expired, was long yet to rise. The daily ration went down well, and the men began to hound Strummer to sing. This was a chance to get his hands free. They itched at the prospect, but he refused to let his excitement betray him, and he played coy. First, he didn't know many songs. Surely none that they'd like to hear anyways. Then he claimed he was too embarrassed to sing for strangers. Finally, he asked what was a song without his strings, but poetry gone wrong. He'd nary find a tune without his mandolin. And he didn't stop making his points until the men had pestered Argent into submission and placed the finely tuned instrument into Strummer's hands. Though he was surprised when he realized his iron shackles wouldn't cause much issue if he kept his playing restrained, he let the iron chain rattle obnoxiously against the hollow face and obstruct the strings. Strummer fumbled through a few half-hearted fingerings, making a show of how difficult it would be while bound. "I'm afraid you'll have to find me back in town," he said. The men erupted into protest. They looked toward Dabin first, hoping he'd produce the key to unbind him, but even as unflappable as he was, he broke and he looked toward Argent, hoping to pass the buck to a more stoic voice. But before Argent could even say a word, an unfamiliar voice called out from the darkness. "Let the man sing a song, Argent." Argent winced, cast a long glance at Dabin, then gave a terse nod. Their noble benefactor materialized from the dimness at the far side of camp, dressed the way that Strummer presumed rich boys thought proper woodsmen dressed. It was all rich greens and burgundies with thick leather belts. A thick plume of flaxen hair swept back into a bun pinned behind his head, letting his pale face catch the light from their lamps. At least he wore wool. The man was dry, and so too were his feet. Perhaps he was not a lost cause this far from home. "Much better," Strummer said as Dabin unchained him, flourishing his fingers across the fingerboard. The tension released in an instant as his music settled throughout the camp. "Perhaps we want to hear a song about a lost prince?" Strummer's fingers went to work, weaving a sonic tapestry that spoke of a burning desert sun. "Or the greatest thief who ever lived?" The notes left the instrument, bright and clipped, weaving rapidly between danger and brilliance. Some of the men clapped their gloved hands in approval, but one spoke up. "Sing Old Bow High!" Strummer wasted no time and began moving through the phrasing. His fingers knew the song well, and he whizzed through their movements without a second thought. Old Bow High was a great song, complex when it needed to be, but simple enough to sing along. The folks in these far corners of the world loved it. Even Rayner, with a heart of stone, tapped his foot. His face was a granite mask, but he wasn't immune to music, at least. Few men were. The camp was clearly enjoying it, and it was a trite better than rotting the night away with shackles on. So Strummer let the song wander. He added verses of his own devise, verses heard only in seedy brothels, and verses muttered only by clergymen come holy day. It went on twice as long as it should, then 3 times, but it felt good to work his mind on something other than just escape. When he finally brought the song into land, he tacked on an added flourish, marking each cheer of their applause with a stream of twinkling notes. "Another!" they shouted. Strummer feigned consideration, since he already knew what he wanted to play. "Why not one about this very wood?" he offered with just the right amount of conspiracy. "What happened in these woods worth talking about?" Rufus asked over the clamor. "Nothing true, Roof. Don't fall for it. It's just a song," Kenya called. She was one of the more sensible ones. "The truth doesn't always lie in what's worth talking about, rather in what's worth not talking about. Strummer let his words linger cryptically. There are things slithering and slavering, hungry for meat, thirsty for blood in any dark wood, from the small kingdoms to the south and beyond, all the way to the silver sands of Tazo, things which ideally must not be spoken of, the worth lying in the value of one's own life. The soldiers fidgeted at the idea of forbidden songs and dark terrors. This song is for the haughty spirits which roam aimless, confused on this soil, souls freed from their mortal coil by the crone Bazu, Strummer said. But this seemed to break the tension, if only for a minute. Bazu, piss off! It's a child's tale, one shouted, and they all snickered at the interruption. And why do we tell these children's tales? Strummer lectured, letting the question linger. There's always a kernel of truth buried in the silly things we teach children. A hidden lesson, hidden meaning, often tied to a time and place beyond our easy recollection. Bazu is no different. He punctuated his words with a frighteningly dissonant chord. The germs are there, the bones of truth buried beneath silly rhymes and dances, but if one were to dig a little deeper, another unsettling chord let loose on the camp. Well, those stories aren't appropriate for children. The camp was his. They hung on Strummer's every word. He wanted so badly to rip the dream away from them, to shatter it before their very eyes. He could think of no crueler twist of the knife than to disturb them now. But he didn't. He let the power of the story awaken, giving it life with the sweet breath of song. It was not a happy tune, nor was it sad. It verged on horrifying when performed correctly. The notes all clashed with one another in a way that transfixed and unsettled, and the words were carried on a ghostly chorus that seemed to reverberate between the black shapes of the trees. Strummer always viewed it more of a church song, and he was in his church. This was his sanctuary, and the steeple reached far above them. One day it could be the staghorn, but today it was the tree-top canopy above. The forested hunger, it thirst for a sight. There's something here that's hollow, lifeless, and divine, Strummer sang. Carefully watching his audience, Strummer spied them moving between states of horror. Some squirmed in their boots, others turned their blushing faces, hiding shades of fear from their peers. Even the young noble was stirred. Only Kenya and Perry were immune to this song. Not the music, they tapped their feet and swayed their hips to the turbulent rhythm, but the words. They were rational women and powerful, a combination that was hard to frighten. Argent, however, was unmoved entirely. When Strummer finally reached the final verse, he let the notes float a little longer and allowed the piece to spiral downward as it resolved. The song carried into the trees and into the night sky, and he watched the last vestiges of it sail upward with drafts of smoke from the fire and tried to glimpse the stars. It was a beautiful night, but was it ending too soon? The horizon was aglow in strange light and growing brighter. It wasn't east, and it certainly wasn't yet dawn, but the sun rose anyway and cast new shadows on the midnight meadow. Except it wasn't the sun. An ill omen, one screamed. Bazu heard us, cried another. It's just a falling star, Sniffer said calmly. Of course, thought Strummer. He'd seen hundreds out here in the wilderness, but never one so low. It dragged across the sky, moving far slower than Strummer had ever seen before. It was blinding, but there was no sound as far as he could tell. It burned blue, then green, and let off orange sparks like a stone skipping across a pond. Like it came, so it went, retreating into the horizon, sinking beneath the darkness of proper night. "The bitch found us already," spat the nobleman. Argent comforted him as the camp erupted into chaos, trying to speak between a chain of profanities. "My lord Aelric, there's not a chance. That was no spell. You heard the guide. It is a common thing." "She's gone on long enough," Aelric howled. "Aye, my liege, there is a chance we may still yet outpace her." Argent offered his fist. "Ugh," Argent said, his fist white on the axe head. There we go. "We make it first light," Argent barked. It was like a wet blanket tossed over any spark Strummer may have fostered. Even Dabin, typically less dour than the others, was pale in the face. "Sorry, mate," he whispered. "I'll take good care of it for you." He slipped the mandolin from Strummer's hands and replaced it with cold iron shackles. Then panic flared anew as Rufus howled. "Dion! Oh, holy night, Matt just killed Dion!" he cried. Steel was drawn in an instant, and the lamps were brought to bear on the grisly scene. Matt stood over Dion's body, a bloody knife held forth in shaky hands as tears welled up in his eyes. "Matt? What in the hollowest of hells did you do?" Perry said, fear and shock coloring her tone. He... Matt couldn't get the words out before his body convulsed into racking sobs. The tension was insurmountable. All sense of discipline was evaporating before Summer's eyes. Fighting broke out, and the once tight company devolved into a mob. Argent barked over the din, but his orders fell on deaf ears. Even Aelric, who usually left such things to his captain, strode forth and demanded order, drawing brusque remarks from Argent. Raynor, one of Aelric's knights, still in his iron place despite the hour, stomped forth like a bull and grabbed the dissenters by their collars, spitting rebukes until soldiers nodded, and he tossed them into the mud. While Matt lay coiled in a ball, sobbing for his misdeeds, lines were drawn between those who wanted blood for blood and those who wanted order. Strummer did not want to be in chains if things got worse, but he'd find safety in the trees if he had to. He scanned for his things, squinting against the night. Dabin was near with Strummer's mandolin in one hand and his mace in the other, scanning the tree line and casting furtive glances toward Argent. His mandolin he could live without if he must, perhaps even his bow. But Pike was still with Argent, and Strummer swore to put him to proper rest. And there was the flask that had cost Pike his life, and very nearly Strummer's life, too. The melee drew on, and above him something caught Strummer's eye. With the rains cleared for now, the Goose Road was a bright tapestry pulled tightly across the sky, but there in the center was a blackness that stirred and shifted unnaturally. His eyes strained and made out a shape of 8 legs, but was startled when a distant and discordant whisper entered his mind. "Kill." Dabin turned to him, and Strummer nearly fell when he saw it wasn't Dabin, but some demon in his place with pallid scales and eyes that burned like coal fire. Survival pumped through Strummer's body, and he yielded all control over to it. Reflexively, his hand darted for the knife that he kept over his heart, but the sheath was empty. His mind raced, but his hands free of violent implements allowed his hot head to cool, and for reason to resume command. "Stay here," it threatened, and stalked over to Argent as it walked. Strummer swore it moved with Dabin's gait. Did it speak with Dabin's voice, too? He could not recall, but as his blood slowed slightly, he began to think he was imagining things. "Kill." The whisper came again, this time more urgently, more desperately. Strummer felt the same sense rise in him, the same urge to survive, to fight and flee, but he recognized the pattern. and allowed it to wash through him, stilling his racing heart with a breathing technique that his grandmother taught him. His mind was under attack, ensorcelled by outside powers. So had Matt's mind, and likely others as well. He cast his eye again to the shadowed canopy and saw the shape moving across some unseen suspension, perhaps a rope, or worse. Then the stench invaded his senses, like sour meat left to rot at the fuller's. He moved his mouth to warn others, getting a mouthful of the fetor and nearly gagging. But as the shape passed over him, it seemed unaware that Strummer had broken free of its enchantments, and his mouth snapped shut. This might be his chance. Death or freedom. Both were at his fingertips, and if he weighed his choices carefully, he could win one and avoid the other. As Dabin closed on Argent and their liege lord, the thing above moved silently into position. It leaned over like a beast at bay, waiting for just the right moment when Strummer realized who its target must be and bounded across the camp. Wordless, Strummer surged forward, clearing his feet off the earth. In the chaos, none noticed his approach or had leave to intervene as he tackled Dabin with all his strength, sending him sprawling to the ground in a tangled heap. In a breathless instant, Argent, Ewan, and even Aelric drew deadly steel, ready to exact retribution on Strummer. But before they could strike, the thing above crashed to the earth, landing where Dabin had stood not 1 second before. From the ground, the thing appeared as a massive spider, but not. Yes, it had 8 legs, but its 8 eyes were human, and its 8 limbs were human too. Its skin was many colors and was covered with coarse black hair and chitinous plates that seemed melted into the blotchy flesh. At the end of its appendages were human-like hands with razor-edged talons protruding from the tips of each finger. "By the gods!" Ewan cried, cowering from the thing. Argent and Aelric wasted no time dealing violence to it, though, and as Aelric whipped his saber down, the thing recoiled, catching Argent's axe instead, deflecting much of the impact off of a chitin plate, screeching in pain nonetheless. "To your lord, men! Protect your lord!" Argent called. But the chaos was too much to overcome, and none came to his call. Instead, the thing brought all its sinewy strength to bear against Argent and his vicious axe, slashing at the man, its talons glancing off his plate but severing leather straps like woven reeds. Aelric, more skilled than Strummer gave him credit for, flourished his blade and redoubled his attack with a blurry arc. As though it had eyes in the back of its head, the thing seized the man's arms at the elbow and with its free limbs assaulted him until he lost control of his weapon. "Get up," Strummer said as he hauled Dabin to his feet. "You need to free me." And he dragged Dabin out of the fray. Distracted as the thing was, it wasn't enough to break all its enchantments, because a bloody and daring fighter obstructed Strummer's path with a short blade held before him. "I'll gut you like a wet pig," he said. And whether the man meant Dabin or himself, Strummer knew not. But as he plunged with the tip of the blade, Strummer danced ahead and seized the weapon between the chains of his manacles. With a mighty heave, Strummer crushed his head against his assailant's face, breaking their nose and teeth at once. The man went limp, and Strummer, dizzy from the blows to his head, cast him aside and hurried Dabin to further safety. Again, their flight was short-lived. As the thing behind had moved past Argent and seized Strummer by his hood, the maneuver swept him from his feet and nearly took off his head. Then an ironclad knight, Cliff, with an enchantment clouding his mind, stood over Strummer with his axe high, straddling him like he was wood to split. Feathers sprouted from the meat beneath his raised arms, an arrow finding home between sheaves of armor. Shock bloomed on Cliff's face, then pain seized his muscles. Sniffer, not 20 yards away, bought a precious moment which Strummer used to kick at the man's knee, bending it unnaturally. Sheer will kept Cliff on his feet, but Strummer kicked again, stomping at the man's joint with his boot heel until it snapped like a thick oak branch and dropped Cliff to the ground, crying in agony. Now the thing had Aelric. With 2 powerful arms, it suspended him above the ground by the scruff like a rag doll. Eric flailed, trying to free himself. Then crimson spears, gleaming in the lamplight, tested the thing's exposed limbs. Kenya and Perry moved in, thrusting and slashing, probing its defenses, taking bites of its flesh. They weaved a web of steel, ever tightening around the creature. And just when they stretched the limits of its defense, Raynor erupted with his broadsword and rained hell down upon it. Strummer seldom saw attacks so sudden and ferocious. Raynor thrust with his surging steel, then slashed down, then across. The thing was forced to hold Aelric's limp form before it as a human shield, but it barely deterred Raynor and only exposed the thing to attacks from the sisters. With one explosive move, the monstrosity lunged at Raynor and, with 6 of its limbs free, pinned him down to the ground like a specimen for dissection. The thing quivered in ecstasy, then, lightning quick, buried its fangs into Raynor's neck. The pain must have been exquisite, for he screamed and cried and gnashed his teeth as he beat his mauled fist against the thing, but not a sound left his mouth. When the fangs retracted, Strummer was shocked by how long they were. Raynor convulsed violently, then went still. Though the thing was stymied and bloodied, Strummer couldn't see how he would survive the night if he stayed. But where could he go? His hands were still bound, and only Dabin had the key. The fool abandoned him and was now rushing to his lord's aid, defiant and screaming into the night with his mace raised to the sky. The thing carried Aelric like a child, and still smote all who dared dance with it. Strummer took the chance to shuffle free of the carnage, sliding through mud and viscera until he came to Dion's corpse and rose to his... sliding through mud and viscera until he came to Dion's corpse and rose to his feet, pulling Dion's hunting sword free of its scabbard. But before he could escape into the dark, Dabin's cries of pain jerked Strummer's eyes back around. The thing had its talons sunk so deeply into Dabin's body that it slowly peeled him open, blood escaping like juice from a ripe melon. His boiled leathers were rent as easily as his own flesh, and ropes of tissue and meat snapped as they were torn apart. Strummer couldn't betray Dabin's kindness with cowardice, and, clenching the hilt of Dion's hunting sword between his chained hands, he darted into the fray. The thing didn't see Strummer coming as his sword took its first bite of flesh, and then a second, forcing it to drop Dabin's corpse. The blade was little better than a glorified butcher's knife compared to his own steel, but it drew blood easily. The thing was quick, and soon Strummer was dodging death by breathless margins as its talons swiped and slashed, seeking his flesh. From the corner of Strummer's eye stormed Argent, his frenzy fueled by the sight of his mutilated soldier. The hulking man's heavy armor didn't slow him a single step as the thing attacked with a tornado of flesh. 6 limbs assaulted him, and Argent simply ducked sidestepped, moved in close, and brought his axe into the thing's face, if it could be called that, savagely bisecting one group of eyes and burying the blade deep within its chitinous flesh. For a brief and glimmering moment, Argent and Strummer fought the abomination with mirrored ferocity. Its blur of limbs was matched by theirs. Each attack it dodged or parried, they summoned another twice over. It was a dance of death, and Strummer let Argent lead. These were the types of moments that poets waxed about through the ages, Strummer thought. The stuff of songs. But it couldn't last, not while Strummer's hands were bound. However it happened, Argent was batted aside like a kicked dog, and Strummer was on his back, disarmed and fighting for his life. The chains between his wrists held the thing's slavering maw at bay. Its mandibles undulated and quivered. It thirsted for Strummer's blood, but his arms grew weaker. His fate drew closer. With each inch he lost the next even faster. "Die!" the abomination hissed and shrieked. Only death would deter Argent, though. With blood in his eyes and murder peeling from his lips, he cleaved the thing's limb from its body, sending a mangled and monstrous arm sailing through the air. As the beast turned its face toward Argent, Strummer seized a fanged mandible with his chains, leaned up, and sunk his teeth into its flesh, rending tissue until hot fluid squirted forth, splashing on his face and arms. His flesh tingled, then burned, but he did not let go. Strummer channeled his own inner beast and resolved to die unyielding. Even as the thing recoiled and tried to withdraw, Strummer was like a dog with a bone and wouldn't release until flesh began to part and tear like spoiled fruit. In his mouth, Strummer held the squirming mandible of a deformed aberration. It tasted of offal and human waste. From the end extended a fang nearly as long as his forearm. The creature could have killed him in that moment. But Argent didn't give him the chance. Instead, the world went black and oddly calm as Strummer felt himself enveloped in a blanket of oozing, viscous fluid. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one. I'm going to spare our innkeeper the extra work, and I'm going to walk us out myself. Thanks a lot for listening. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the story, you can go and find it in its original published form at Savage Realms Monthly Magazine, which is available with a digital download or a print-on-demand book over on Amazon. You can also find, if you like, what you're reading with Strummer or hearing from Strummer, I featured a story of his a few months back on this very podcast stream. So just rewind and see what you can find. I have one more episode for you. It's a little bit shorter next week. So return if you want to hear the thrilling conclusion of what happens in Black Fruit, written by me, Rhett. Until then, grab your sword and keep on adventuring.